All right. Just to wrap up today, I thought it might be interesting to present some of my own personal views about future exploration trends and copper deposits. Clearly, copper is a very important metal as we increasingly move into the metal electronic age. And so this is all about some of the things I think are important as we move forward with time. The presentation outlined a little bit about the giant porphyry copper deposits and future mining, copper supply and demand issues, global issues for existing projects, and some market trends for new copper deposits. Copper has been a strategic element for a very long time. It goes back thousands and thousands of years. The English word copper actually comes from the ancient Roman name of Cyprian, which was the name for the island of Cyprus, which is probably where copper production first began in human history. It has so many uses, and it's specifically its ability to carry electricity. It's the only element that can cost effectively do that. Silver also is a good conductor, but of course there's a huge variance in the price of copper and the price of silver. The large copper mines, the really big ones, have a long lifespan. And so here's Ok Tedi, which was the first copper mine to be developed on the island of Papua New Guinea. It was discovered pre-1981 and it came into production in 1981, and it's still in production today, and it has a mine life which will extend out to 2050. And so that's approximately 70 years of substantial copper production just from one large porphyry copper gold deposit. This gives you some idea of the lifespan and also the scale. The footprint of these very large copper porphyries is enormous. This is Escondida in northern Chile, and that has a footprint of 120 square kilometers. And when you think about this in today's world, and the difficulty of developing large-scale surface open pits with respect to responsible mining and the environment, it's becoming increasingly difficult. And I stress the word responsible. Mining has come a long way since the last century in terms of protecting and respecting the environment and all other kinds of social issues. Here's another very large copper porphyry, copper moly porphyry, that's operated by Freeport in southeast Arizona, and this is Morenci, and that too has a footprint of roughly 80 square kilometers. So if you're going to develop a very large open pit long life porphyry deposit by surface methods, then it's going to require a huge surface footprint. Bingham Canyon, the largest open pit copper mine in the world, arguably, after, well, Chuquicamata in Chile is comparable. This is certainly the largest open pit in North America, and that has a footprint of 60 square kilometers. And even more if we took into account the peripheral mines that operated on the base metal skarns adjacent to the porphyry. Grasberg is an underground operation now, but was formerly an open pit. That has a 20 square kilometer footprint, and that's because only the initial part of the mining operation was open pit, and the majority of the resource is actually underground block cave. And there's a section, a 3D model of the Grasberg mine. So the actual diameter of the open pit is 1.6 kilometers. However, the underground mine persists for what is now known to be 2 kilometers, not 1.2. So there's a huge underground resource still waiting to be developed at the Grasberg Block Cave. The photo on the left is an historic photo pre-mining, and it shows the discovery, where the discovery hole was of the Grasberg ore body at an elevation of 4,200 meters. The extent of the mineralization at Grasberg probably extends for more than a vertical interval of 3 kilometers. The tailings facility, I commented about it, Oyu Tolgoi. The footprint of Oyu Tolgoi is roughly 50 square kilometers, and out of that, the tailings dam alone has a footprint of 12 square kilometers. So where you put the tailings in a large-scale porphyry or a large-scale copper mine becomes a very important economic consideration. Water treatment is another very important aspect of develop, or where you might develop a large copper mine. For example, in Chile, most of the operations are in the high elevations of the Andes, and water is very scarce. And in fact, a lot of the water which is required for mining and processing is actually seawater that has to be transported from the coast. So infrastructure, logistics, availability of water become key considerations in where you might look to explore or develop large-scale copper deposits. Here are some of the operations or projects here in Southeast Asia. Tailings disposal, equally important, because in many areas it's not possible to create tailings dams within highly developed areas or environmentally sensitive areas. The only alternative to that is to place the tailings in a deep sea environment. And this actually does take place in a responsibly environmental way at Batu Hijau, which is a large gold copper porphyry in Indonesia, and the gold mines of Lihir Sembiri in Papua New Guinea, and the Ramu nickel operation. Elsewhere, it takes years or may never happen to get legislative approval to put tailings offshore. It's subject to the topography of the offshore region, and in a deep trench environment, it's been demonstrated it's responsibly possible, whereas perhaps in a plateau environment, it would be totally unacceptable. Power, too, is another really important consideration. Kamoa-Kakula, which is the world's largest, highest grade copper deposit currently in construction and development and production, the average of the power is actually coming from hydro. And that really makes a difference on the impact of the economics of a big project. Because if you have to take your power from the grid, it's just going to be so much more expensive. So either hydrothermal power or geothermal power would be very big economic advantages in developing a very large copper deposit. The lead time for development, it's not just the history of the mine, it's how long it takes from discovery to production. In this case, again, Kamoa-Kakula, the deposits were discovered in 1995 and first production took place in 2022. That took 27 years, which is slightly above average if you statistically look at perhaps 50 large-scale copper deposits. 20 to 22 years is a typical period. Ivanhoe's Oyu Tolgoi was relatively fast. From discovery in 1998 through to production in 2010 was only 12 years. So that's considered very fast. but it's an important consideration because throughout the development phase, it's necessary to raise capital. And for the billions of dollars that are required for these developments, the financiers, of course, want their capital payback as quickly as possible. They don't want to, if they have to wait for 20 years to get their capital paid back, mining is not a good investment. I commented the fact that the problems that Rio had with the Mongolian government, constantly changing the regulations and agreements, and that actually pushed the capital development costs back in terms of dollars, and most importantly, in terms of time. So stable economic legislature is a key factor in developing any project, actually, but specifically high capital intensive mining projects. Another thing that is a consideration is getting everything right during the pre-feasibility stage. And geotechnical aspects are critically important, because if you don't understand fully the implications of geotechnical issues, then that can create a huge problem. And in the case of Anglo's Cuejavejo mine in southern Peru, they hadn't fully understood that there was implications from a very large fault system. And once they recognized that, they had to redesign the mine, and also that resulted in costs overruns and in time. The same thing recently happened at Kamoa and Kakula, where there was a mining seismic event, and that basically shut down the mine for several weeks. So there's a number of factors that all have to come together for successful development of big projects. Mine closure and reclamation is also critical. And this is what was Molycorp's Cuesta mine in northern New Mexico. And once that mine closed, the mine closure costs, as determined by the Environmental Protection Agency, was something like $1.2 billion. So even after the mine has closed, there are still significant economic factors involved. And this is the super fund that was required. Part of that is capital from the government, and then part of it was from the last owner, Chevron, and they had to create a super fund for reclamation, full reclamation of this deposit in New Mexico. And that fund is over $1 billion US. Surprisingly, when you look across from the former mine, there's the same kind of alteration and weak mineralization that's naturally occurring, and there's no plan to rehab that. So it begs the question as what is realistically feasible in terms of environmental reclamation and mine closure. This is Red Chris in northern BC in Canada. 2 small open pits, and more recently, drilling was done and high-grade underground resources were found in what we call pencil porphyries. Pencil porphyries are cylindrical type porphyry copper deposits that have very high grade and can be mined either with block cave, sub-level block cave, or long hole stoping methods. And what's the key here is having a cylindrical or cylinder-like body of very high grade mineralization, because if you design a block cave, that has a much smaller footprint than obviously an open cut. However, it still has the cave area, several square kilometers, which can be extremely challenging in an area that's highly populated. But ideally, the best mining scenario, if you have a high-grade cylindrical core, is for long hole stoping. That's a lower capex, high-grade mining operation with absolutely minimal surface footprint. It doesn't develop the entire resource, but it's a clear alternative to developing the huge open pit porphyries, which in my opinion is becoming harder and harder to develop with time, subject of course to where you are. if you're somewhere in Siberia or in the Gobi Desert where there's minimal social environmental impact, it's still possible. But in areas where there are environmental and social considerations, Lepanto in the Philippines is a classic case. Creating open pits or block caves is just simply not sustainable. One of the very successful mines in the Philippines is a pencil porphyry copper gold deposit called Didipio, and this is being mined in the Nueva Vizcaya in Luzon. It started out with an open pit, and then that open pit then transitioned into a long hole stoping underground mine, which is successfully extracting and developing the high grade gold copper porphyry. And this in fact is Oceania's most profitable mine of all their global operations. There's the 3D model. So we have the porphyry, and then underneath the porphyry, the long hole stoping development. So minimal surface impact. And furthermore, the long hole stoping, excuse me. I'm going the wrong way. Yeah, okay, here we go. So yeah, that long hole stoping allows you to put backfill down in the mine and reduces the surface volumes of your dumps. So here's the advantages of these lower capex selective underground mining. Much smaller footprint, lower capex, faster payback, high margins and less rehabilitation. And I see this as a trend that's going to be more important in future copper production and exploration. Rio Tinto and Codelco are just one of the few, or one of several companies who are now doing research on this and how to take advantage of these factors. Another option, which is also becoming important, is actually solution mining. And this involves extraction of the metals in ground without having to mine the ore and do the processing on surface. It's ideal for some uranium deposits. This is the case and has been for a long time in the uranium mining in northeastern Kazakhstan. It's also applicable for some gold deposits, heap leach, and more recently for in situ mining of secondary copper deposits. So the concept is to fracture the rock, inject the solutions which recover the metal, bring those to surface and simply process them in a small plant with a small footprint at surface. A very good example of this, which is a significant deposit, is Ivanhoe Electric's Casa Grande deposit in Arizona, which will be mined using this technology. And it's a very high-grade, sizable economic project. This simply shows the different categories of ore. And so the exotic in pink and the oxide in blue can all be mined using solution mining. And there's the Eiffel Tower for scale to give you a sense of size. Here are some deposits that are remained undeveloped and the potential reasons why they haven't gone into production. There's starting with Udakan, it's located in a very remote area. Nice size, nice grade, but the capex is simply too high. As the copper price increases, this may change the economics. Pebble in Alaska has very significant environmental aspects. Tampakan in the Philippines is geopolitical in terms of local communities and government. Then we have Frida River, which looks like it will now go into production simply because of poor infrastructure. Kamoa-Kakula is now definitely in serious production, so that's been resolved. Los Sulfatos, the capex, once again, the increasing copper price will change the economics. And Rio Dig is also now going into construction. So there's a few of the deposits that are still around that may or may not be developed. In the US, there's two deposits that are really significant. one was on that list, Pebble, and that's because of environmental considerations. Resolution copper, under the present Trump administration or Republican administration, may go into production with changes in legislation. Time will tell. And the issues with resolution is minority local Apache Indians who resist the project because of their cultural sites and tribal significance. Pebble, it's gone up and down a number of times depending on which government is in control in the US, and it may be that the legislation could change with more environmental constraints that it might allow the company that has the deposit to develop it. This is a very large deposit in Panama, First Quantum, Cobre Panama. They had all of their agreements with the government in place, everything, the environmental, all the permits they needed, they had. They funded it, started developing the mine, and then the rules changed. So what happened was it became very political. First Quantum had done a fantastic job of doing all the background studies, environmental studies, ecological studies, baseline studies of water, everything, to ensure that it was way beyond international standards for the biodiversity of the region. However, local communities were politicized, and then they had an anti-government movement, and they created a massive problem for the current government at the time and for the company. And this protest commenced around 2023, and it rapidly exploded into the anti-government sentiment, where the Pan American Highway was closed on several occasions. But the issue here is that it was more political than anything else. All the environmental aspects, cultural aspects had been well and truly agreed, and all the research had been done to allow the company to proceed. So here's an example of politics getting involved at the national level, and eventually basically took down the government. So this put the mine in limbo. It was closed. It's still closed, and there's been a new government elected, and they're now looking at how to solve this problem and potentially get the mine going again. As part of this process, the government is facing, just from one agreement alone that they have with the a state Korean company, they're facing a 700 million lawsuit under a free trade agreement. So it's a complicated issue. Hopefully it can get resolved eventually. It's looking positive at the moment, but until this actually happens, we won't know the outcome. So these are things that can go sadly very wrong in some of these very high cost, multi-billion-dollar, large-scale mining projects developments. I mentioned earlier that political stability with respect to resource and development is absolutely essential. Here's a plan of Central America. There are a number of large projects in Panama. Cobre Panama is not the only one. There's a very big deposit called Cerro Colorado. That's been sitting in the ground since the 1960s for geopolitical reasons. There are many high-grade gold deposits in Costa Rica, which are undeveloped because of anti-mining sentiment. Nicaragua, up until the last 2 years ago, had the same issues. However, they have now introduced new legislation favorable for mining investment, and it's become, there's a rush taking place there for companies to invest in the mineral sector in Nicaragua. It looks like El Salvador is going to do the same thing. So this year I expect investors to start returning to El Salvador, and Guatemala is still very unstable. So there's just one district of the world that is an example of geopolitics. As I mentioned, El Salvador now has realized that to revitalize their economy, responsible mining is one option, and they look to be aggressively pursuing that. Colombia has its ups and downs, and it depends very much which part of Colombia one's operating. They do have a very large mining sector, and it contributes a very big amount of funds to the economy, but it depends, as I said, on local governments and where one is within the country. But it is overall, it's very pro-mining, and that's playing a big part in their economy. Another interesting project is Reko Diq in Pakistan. This is being developed now by Barrick. It's a large series of copper gold porphyries in the same orogenic belt as Oyu Tolgoi. However, it's located in the province of Baluchistan, which is very next to the Iranian-Afghan border, and the tribal communities there mostly are not in favorable of this development, and it's going to remain to be seen how successful the national government and Barrick are in bringing this project to fruition. Supply and demand, this is what's driving the copper price. So there's no question that globally we're facing an increasing deficit in copper, and this is driven by consumption far exceeding present production and projected production. So by 2030, there's going to be a long-term supply gap in the copper supply demand curve. This will drive copper prices up, which may bring in new projects and exploration. I commented earlier, the lead time between discovery and production is a very, very long time. So where is that supply going to come from? It's a very good question. Here are some of the factors that are involved, and the big copper mining companies and consumers of copper are actually very concerned about this. Recycling and scrap is most definitely not a solution. Here's a comment from the head of BHP, one of the world's largest copper producers. So we need to produce 2 times more copper in the next 30 years than we have previously. And that's an extraordinary statement if you think about the volume and the amount of copper that he's talking about. Here's a graph that shows copper consumption from basically 1900 through to almost today. And you can see there the exponential rise in the demand for copper. And a lot of this, of course, now we're looking at ways that we can do this more efficiently, AI being one of them. However, it's not a solution. It's a tool that we can use to try and become more efficient. Rio Tinto. So here's another statement from BHP. And their chief development officer said in a Melbourne Mining Club meeting not too recently, that we need 26 of the large copper deposits to come on stream to provide enough copper by 2030. Same problem. Others have also said similar statements. AI, I mentioned, it's going to help, but it's definitely not a silver bullet. New technology, yes, we can be more efficient and more effective, but it doesn't solve the volume demand deficit. Codelco, they're the world's top copper producers. They're planning to invest 270 million to revamp its old mine at Chuquicamata. And this is a huge amount just required to convert the open pit into an underground mine, $5.7 billion. So that has to be financed. And most importantly, how long is it going to take to do that? It's not going to happen in 12 months. This shows some of the developments that are around, the mergers that are taking place, and companies positioning themselves and what it's costing to acquire copper assets. Rio Tinto's acquisition of Mongolia, they paid $3.3 billion. It's really, these are very large sums of money. China is the world's largest copper consumer, and they are critically aware of the deficit in copper and what their requirements are going to be moving forward. And they've been aggressively acquiring interests in copper assets globally. And it's not just copper. Here's investments by Chinese companies and projects in Africa. And by far, they are the largest investor in infrastructure and raw materials in Africa as part of their Belt and Road Initiative. And you can see there how they're basically very Africa focused and have been taking long-term views on investments for resources. This also shows commodities and major mineral localities that Chinese companies have been investing in. And you can see there, it's basically the periodic table. So they've taken a medium to long-term view for resources for their future. Moniwa is a good case in point, because here's a photo on the left of Letbadong that was from a 2010 satellite image. And we now look at 2024 as to what Lepidong is today. It looks to me that it's been basically mined out. And so all of the copper resources that were produced at Lepidong basically all went to China. They've taken a large interest in a company they own in a copper project in Botswana, and that company is called MMG. They have assets in all over the world, Australia, Africa, South America, and they're planning to spend 700 million to double the copper output of a mine they control in Botswana. Acquisitions, Newmont has historically been a gold company. They operated in Myanmar for a number of years, actually, and they recently took over a company called Newcrest, and that created the world's biggest gold mining company. However, Newcrest had very significant copper assets, mines and projects, and that was one of the driving issues for Newmont to take over Newcrest so that they could acquire and have access to significant copper production. Yep, that's more about the Newmont takeover. Unfortunately, I can't see the top of my slides because the message recording is showing, but that's okay. I know what the slides are. That's the project I mentioned in Botswana, and that's the acquisition cost that MMC paid for this substantial copper deposit. Peru is taking a very proactive view of expanding their mineral production. Peru is well endowed with mineral deposits and specifically copper, and they understand the importance of the mineral exploration business to the economy. And so they're recreating favorable legislation for mostly copper projects in the mining industry. And what that has resulted in is the awakening of 75 projects with foreign investment. That's a repeat, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. Mexico, on the other hand, is whilst they recognize the now that's Peru. Yeah, Peru at a recent conference, an international conference, clearly stated their new initiatives and the portfolio of mining projects that they want to see developed throughout the country. And this is a really positive move for the economy and the people of Peru. Mexico would like to do similar. However, some of their legislation has really become very restrictive for foreign investment. And whilst the local companies could do well, I perceive that direct foreign investment will probably decline in the next few years. Casabel in Peru is an interesting project. In Ecuador, not Peru. It was found in roughly 2012, and it's scheduled for development by 2030, which is actually not too bad. That's only 17 years if you consider the 22-year average I alluded to. It's got a relatively low capex at 2.7 billion. It's a series of pencil porphyries, which is good, and the 5-year payback is what the financiers are looking for. So if they can get all of their capital back, whether it's 10 or 12 billion over 15 years, if they can get that back in 3 to 5 years, they're very happy. Papua New Guinea has a very large and very important mining industry that's I think it's the majority contributor to their economy, much like Australia, and they have very favorable foreign investment regulations for existing and developing new mining projects. Bougainville has been a real problem. That was the first copper mine after Ok Tedi to be developed in Papua New Guinea in the 70s. It became a real issue with social problems, and eventually the mine was closed, and nothing has happened since the late 70s. Rio Tinto still, or had it up until recently, and they figured it would take $5 to $6 billion to resume full operations, which is a very large amount of money. Discovery trends have dropped off dramatically with time. This highlights the problem of supply-demand gap. So we're no longer finding or discovering the really big copper deposits. There's a number of reasons for this, which I can go into in another presentation on Tuesday, but it clearly highlights the magnitude of the problem. So here's the number of prospects and exploration advanced projects that are shown in a database, and it outlines where the most advanced exploration projects are in terms of dollars spent. And it's clear that these jurisdictions are not the main or most prospective countries, but in terms of exploration expenditure, it's Canada, Australia, and the United States. If you took just the geological potential, the big circles would be Chile, Peru, Mexico, and the Philippines, which is not even on this, but it shows the disparity between favorable legislations, geopolitics, and geologic potential. Here are some of the world's biggest copper projects, and the ones without the stars are all porphyry coppers. The ones with the stars are different types of deposits, and so it's clear that the future for or the prospects that one would be exploring for would be porphyries and sediment hosted. Some of these are sediment hosted, I think a couple of them, but the majority of the copper resources are held in porphyry copper deposits. It's something like 60 to 65% of the world's copper comes from porphyry copper deposits. The Philippines is not on this list, and nor is Myanmar. policy shifts. This is what's happened in the Philippines over the past few years. Several years of totally negative policies. Since 2021, more favorable legislature, but it still has to translate into foreign investment. And so here's the conclusions. In any jurisdiction, there needs to be new and efficient government initiatives to attract major investment capital for the mining sector. And that has to be medium to long term. And the implementation of industry standards, environmental and social policies for responsible development. And I think, yeah, that's the final slide. And so I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have. And it looks like, yeah, we're right on time. Good.